Kia ora, I'm Kitty Prentice and welcome to Māori Minds, where I explore Māori philosophy and mental health and find new ways of applying traditional knowledge. This video, Tika or Teka, Common Misconceptions About Māori Philosophy, follows on from my previous video, Te Kaunga Raruraru, 10 Problems with Māori Philosophy. It's part of the Uncovering Māori Philosophy series. So Tika means straight or true, and it is the root word of tikanga, which is the practical face of mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge. Teka means false. So now that we've got that straight, or tika, I'm going to go over the outline of this video. There are 3 common misconceptions about Māori philosophy, which I'm going to explore. Number 1, that it doesn't exist. Number 2, that it's just mythology. And number 3, that it's all just primitive animism. So the impact of these misconceptions is that Māori philosophy tends to be dismissed, miscategorised, undervalued and ridiculed. And if none of that takes your fancy, I'm also going to be talking about red feather headdresses, a 3-fingered Māori chief, dead bodies in trees, Charles Darwin, Governor George Grey, and I'll also be talking about a little bit of local history about Takapuna Beach. Takapuna Beach in Tāmaki Makaurau. A great place for picnics with whānau, long walks on the beach, quality time with the kids, and grabbing a coffee with friends. Taka can mean rock or peak, and puna means spring. The real Takapuna is actually found at a spring near Maunga Uika, North Head. The beach looks out across to a young volcano, Rangi Toto, or Te rangi I totongia ai te ihu o Tāmaki Kapua, the day the nose of Tāmaki Kapua bled. He was the captain of the Te Arawa Waka. An original name for the Rangi Toto channel is Te Awanui or Peretu, the big river or channel of Peretu. Peretu was a rangatira, a chief of the iwi of Ngaitai. He was said to have only had 3 fingers. The ridges atop the peak of Rangi Toto are named Ngā Pono Toru or Peretu, the 3 knuckles of Peretu. Many old Pohutukawa trees line the coast of Te Ika a Maui, the North Island, and it's Pohutukawa trees that are the unifying theme or representation for this video. Let me share with you a Whakatāuki from Te Arawa Waka. E hoa, ruke atu tō kura, ka nui te kura kaiuta e ngā ngahu mai nei. Oh friend, throw away your red feather headdress, there are many red plumes dancing on the shore. This Whakatāuki refers to the arrival of the Te Arawa Waka to Aotearoa. The crew mistakenly thought the blossoming Pohutukawa trees were a multitude of feathered birds. Without first checking, they threw overboard their prized red feather headdresses, expecting that they would make new ones once on land. It must have been summer when they arrived. You could say that the moral of this Whakatāuki is, don't jump to conclusions before you have all the facts. You might regret it. This grove of Pohutukawa is called Te Urutapu. Tapu means sacred and uru means a grove. The trees here have a particular sacred and special value. That is why they are cherished, respected and protected by Māori and protected by the Auckland City Council. Unfortunately, in September this year, vandals poisoned and felled some 23 trees and shrubs in the sacred grove. I'm guessing they did that to improve their sea views. So what is the special significance of these trees? Traditionally, when Māori passed away, their bodies were carefully wrapped in a fetal position with harakeke, and then they were suspended from these trees. Then nature was allowed to take its course, so all the birds and the bees would remove the flesh from the bones. Eventually, when it was just the bones that were remaining, a tōkunga, a priestly expert, would clean the bones and prepare them for their final resting place. And that might be a cave like the ones in Rangi Toto, or some of the core iwi, the bones or skeleton, were hidden within trees, and this would prevent people from desecrating them. So knowing that selected trees can have such a special purpose as to hold tūpapaku bodies suspended from their branches, such as the case with the Urutapu in Takapuna, you can appreciate how sacred this place is. According to Māori, a violation of tapu or sacred spaces, wāhi tapu like this, can result in mate Māori, a type of illness. So I'm guessing that local iwi, the mana whenua, have taken appropriate steps and made use of tikanga to ensure that that space has been made safe so that the public and people won't be afflicted by mate Māori or sickness. I doubt that the vandals who cut down these trees knew of its history. It's not a secret, it's just not common knowledge. Oftentimes Māori history and mātauranga Māori aren't well known by non-Māori. Cutting down trees of sacred value to Māori and of historic importance to the community. Is that tika or teka? It wasn't a legal action, and it may have been done in ignorance, and it definitely wasn't according to tikanga. He tika he teka rānei, he aha o whakaaro. Putting aside the problems of Māori philosophy, which I spoke about in my previous video, such as the fact that the Māori culture is an oral culture without any written sacred texts or philosophical books, Māori, and more broadly Indigenous philosophy, is conspicuously absent from the minds of early Western thinkers, philosophers, ethnographers, and even people who wrote about Māori and Indigenous people. Concepts that shape Māori ethics and metaphysics, which are common across the Pacific, such as mana and tapu and noa and mauri and wairua and utu and ho, were mostly categorised as religious concepts and evidence of primitive reasoning. But why is this the case? The existence of Māori philosophy seems to have been ignored, dismissed, reduced or completely eliminated. To me, it's implausible to think that Māori would be without philosophy. He tika he teka rānei, he aha o whakaaro. There are many Māori kōrero pūrākau, traditional stories that are well known. The many adventures of Maui who slowed down the transit of the sun and fished at the North Island of Aotearoa, Te Ika a Maui. The creation story of the separation of Rangi Nui Sky Father and Papatuanuku Earth Mother. The many tamariki of Rangi Nui and Papatuanuku, Tangoroa, the god of the oceans, Tāne Mahuta, the god of the forests. While Māori categorise these stories as kōrero pūrākau, many Europeans have labelled them as myths, fairy tales or legends. There are many different definitions for these terms. To me, a fairy tale is a local story that has supernatural themes, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve God or deities. But at its core, it's false, it's a fiction. Myths I take to mean those stories that have a greater cultural value than fairy tales, and they have some explanatory power, so they may explain the creation of the universe or of man. They have supernatural themes and sometimes they can include deities. But again, they are a work of fiction. Legends in my mind have some link to a historic fact or figure, but overall, at their core, they are false, a fiction. So essentially, kōrero pūrākau were categorised as teka, false. Many kōrero pūrākau relate to actual events and people. Most kaumātua that I have spoken to believe that Maui was an actual real person, that great Polynesian ancestor of ours. There are many kōrero pūrākau about Maui and his adventures that form the substrate of mātauranga Māori, Māori knowledge, related to sailing and navigation. Some, for example, contain specific information about the route to travel from Samoa down through the Pacific, through the Cook Islands, to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Some Māori interpret kōrero pūrākau quite literally, while others do not. Kōrero pūrākau are highly metaphorical and serve many functions, like being memory aids for the transmission of knowledge and history down generations in a people without a written language. They contain archetypal figures and moral lessons. Kōrero pūrākau were designed to be understood by all, including tamariki, children. But here's the point of difference. They were also designed to be unpacked and analysed by adults in whare wānanga, schools of higher learning. And for the elite select few who are training to be tohunga, so priestly experts and scholars, kōrero pūrākau were a tool for understanding Māori cosmology and metaphysics. To me, labelling kōrero pūrākau as fairy tales, myths and legends is dismissive and pejorative. It reduces kōrero pūrākau, which was a major vehicle for the transmission of mātauranga Māori knowledge, to naive fantasy and fiction. I suspect that people's willingness to accept this miscategorisation of kōrero pūrākau really stifled deeper inquiry and exploration of Māori philosophy. He tika, he teka rānei. He aha o whakaaro. I can understand why comparative mythology became so popular with psychoanalysts like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, and anthropologists like Edward B. Tylor. I find it exciting to learn of similarities between the stories of different people who seemingly have no discernible connection to one another. There's the Greek god Prometheus, the Sumerian birth goddess Namu, the Lord God of the Bible, and Tāne Mahuta. All of them fashioned the first man out of the earth, out of clay, except Tāne Mahuta, the god of the forest. The first human created was a woman, Hine Ahuone. Comparative mythology presents a number of problems. For instance, its exploration of each story and the cultural context which spawned it can be too superficial, and it tends to run the risk of overgeneralizing. Comparative mythology became so popular around the time that Charles Darwin gained notoriety for his theory of evolution. And there was this notion linking primitive man and primitive religion to mythology, and that notion persists to this day. One of the more influential proponents of this idea that certain races that tended to be dark-skinned were stuck in this primitive stage of human evolution, particularly in terms of their religion, was the anthropologist Edward B. Tylor. Tylor was an English anthropologist, and his work on primitive culture back in 1871 described his version of animism. He had a two-part theory of animism. He believed that religion evolved from a doctrine of souls. So he imagined that primitive man might have dreamed about a deceased relative, and upon wakening thought that perhaps because they're dreaming of them, some part of them must persist, and thus was born this concept or idea of the immortal soul. Even in healthy waking life, the savage or barbarian has never learned to make the distinction from subjective and objective, between imagination and reality. Basically, he was saying that they were too dumb to tell the difference between a dream and reality, and that's why they came to believe in souls and that inanimate and animate objects were all alive. From the doctrine of souls evolved the doctrine of spirits, where primitive man explained natural events through the actions of demons and gods. At that stage, they developed rites and rituals to influence spirits and control natural events. The evolutionary trajectory as Tylor saw it was like this. First there was animism, and then evolved polytheism, theism, and finally the pinnacle of human evolution, scientific rationalism. By today's standards, it's easy to criticise Tylor as being too Eurocentric, but there are a few other criticisms of his way of thinking. For one, you can't time travel back and interview Paleolithic man and say, "Hey bro, how did you come up with this idea of souls in your version of religion?" The theory can't be tested. It's not empirical. It's just made up. You can't assume that indigenous people or pre-industrial dark-skinned races have maxed out their evolutionary potential and are suffering with a type of religious developmental arrest, stuck in the stage of animism that somehow perfectly mirrors Paleolithic man. Critics of Tylor have also commented that he didn't sufficiently consider the socio-political context. For instance, the impact of British colonialism on Indigenous peoples and how they were actively adapting to that at the time. There is one other really obvious counterexample to Tylor's theory of animism. Ancient Greeks were scientifically and technologically advanced for their time. They had great philosophers, and they were also polytheists. And according to Tylor, polytheism is just one step higher than animism. Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859, and evidently that had a great impact on Edward B. Tylor, who published his work some 10 years later. Did you know that Darwin actually visited Aotearoa? Only for 9 days in 1835. Unfortunately, he didn't think too much of Aotearoa. No, I used to think, why didn't he stay a bit longer than 9 days? In this predator-free land where it had a unique ecosystem that supported flightless birds. Actually, he did mention Kiwis in his book Origin of Species, or the New Zealand Apteryx, though that was based on the work of other people, not his own personal experience. Well, when you think about it, Charles Darwin did visit Kororareka, Russell, which was seen to be the scourge of the Pacific in 1835, where the lawlessness of English whalers and settlers was so outrageous and so problematic that it prompted a number of northern Māori rangatira chiefs to petition the then king to ratify their declaration of the United Tribes of New Zealand, and a year later he did. Darwin referred to the inhabitants of Aotearoa, excluding certain missionaries, as the very refuse of society. Darwin was very taken with Tylor's work and said, "It's wonderful how you trace animism from the lower races up to the religious beliefs of different races. It will make me for the future look at religion, a belief in soul, etc., from a new point of view." Darwin influenced Tylor. Tylor influenced Darwin. Darwin and Tylor influenced many others. Let's be honest, they were not the first and they were not the only ones who viewed dark-skinned non-Europeans as primitive and inferior. Here's a few local examples. Elsdon Best was a New Zealand-born ethnographer. He studied my people of Ngai Tūhoi and even lived in Urutapu, where I'm from, for a few years. Best wrote numerous books and articles about Māori, particularly my iwi Ngai Tūhoi. Here's a quote from his book, Spiritual and Mental Concepts of the Māori. "The mental concepts of a barbaric race must ever possess an element of interest to the ethnographer, and in studying those of the Māori folk, we encounter much evidence to show that they had evolved a belief in many singular abstractions. This is not an uncommon feature in connection with barbaric peoples, such as those of Indonesia and Farther India and the old-time peoples of Asia. A highly noteworthy characteristic of such races is the fact that they often assigned a greater number of spiritual potentiae to man than do more highly civilized people." Governor George Grey, the Portuguese-born British soldier who went on to become the Governor of South Australia, the twice Governor of New Zealand, Governor of Cape Colony, and the 11th Premier of New Zealand. He also wrote a number of books that are often quoted by people interested in Māori and Aotearoa's history. He's a very significant and colourful figure. This quote comes from Governor Grey's book, Ngā Mahi a Ngā Tupuna, and he explained that his book makes accessible to the many the Māori world, as though talking to a tohunga. That their traditions are puerile is true. That the religious faith of the races who trust in them is absurd is a melancholy fact. But all my experience leads me to believe that the Saxon, Celtic and Scandinavian systems of mythology, could we have become intimately acquainted with them, would be found in no respects to surpass that which the European reader may now thoroughly understand. I believe that the ignorance which has prevailed regarding the mythological systems of barbarous or semi-barbarous races has too generally led to their being considered far grander and more reasonable than they really are. And if you think that animism and primitive religion is a thing of the past, just take a look at the good old Encyclopedia Britannica and what it says about Polynesian religion. Polynesian belief systems emphasised animism, a perspective in which all things, animate and inanimate, were believed to be endowed with a greater or lesser degree with sacred supernatural power. That power, known among Polynesians as mana, could be nullified by various human actions, and many of the region's tapu, prohibitions or taboos, were intended to prevent such behaviours. As is typical of animist cultures, religious concerns permeated all aspects of life. Traditional Māori were not as technologically advanced as their British contemporaries, yet they were island hopping and traversing the Pacific long before Captain Cook arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and long before even Christopher Columbus set off on his expeditions. Still, it became common for British and Europeans to consider Māori as barbaric or primitive, and their religion as animistic. It is important to note that this kind of thinking contributed to the justification of the colonisation of different peoples across the world, including Māori, painting them as primitive and in need of a Western civilising influence. The doctrine of discovery was used to classify non-Christians as non-humans, and thereby allowing the discovery of their already occupied lands and for sovereignty to be claimed over them, as was the experience of the indigenous people of North America. The characterisation of Māori as primitive and barbaric, and the reduction of their values, religion and philosophy to this primitive animism. It not only was a mistake and incorrect, it was also harmful. He tika he teka rānei. He aha o whakaaro. That was a quick, dense overview of 3 common misconceptions about Māori philosophy. 1, that it doesn't exist. 2, that it's just fairy tales, myths and legends. And 3, that it was all just primitive animism, as described by Edward B. Tylor. I also went over some local history about Takapuna, and I shared a Whakatāuki, and they demonstrated how easy it can be to discard things, not knowing their significance or value. And I say that because I think this is the fate that has befallen Māori philosophy. It has been mistakenly discarded. The next video in this series of Uncovering Māori Philosophy is titled Comparing Apples and Tutu Berries, Issues of Incommensurability with Māori Philosophy. Thanks for watching. Like, comment or subscribe to my channel Māori Minds. Ka kite anō.